So here are the images I have on this machine. Now look at our web image. Look at the size of this image. It's 300 megabytes. In this lesson, I'm going to show you a cool technique to reduce this image size beyond your imagination. First, I have to give you a bit of background about React. So back to our project. Let's go to the front-end folder and open up package.json. So here in the script section, we have a bunch of commands. You have seen start and test so far, but we also have the build command for creating optimized assets for production. So we can go to our front-end directory and run npm run build. This is going to create optimized assets for production. Now, as you can see here, all these assets are stored in the build folder. Now, what if you don't use React? Well, these days, a lot of frameworks have the same concept. They have a tool for creating optimized assets for production. How you use that tool is probably different, but that is irrelevant. So back to our project, here in the front-end folder, now we have this build folder that contains all the assets we need for deploying this application. So we can put these assets inside the web server and serve them. Now, let's see how we can create an optimized image for this front-end application. So let's look at our Docker file. What are we doing here? We are starting from a node image so we get access to npm for installing these dependencies. But what if we already have these dependencies? Then we don't need npm, we don't need node. All we have to do is copy these files onto a web server, okay? So this is where we need to create a separate Docker file for production, because the changes we're gonna make only make sense in our production environment, not for development. So back to our project, I'm gonna copy this file, paste it, and then rename it to dockerfile.prod. And of course, we could call this anything. This is just a convention. Now, in this file, first, I want to get rid of all these white spaces because I want to restructure this code in a slightly different way. So on the top, we're starting from node. We're going to add an additional keyword here as to give this stage a label. We can call this anything like build stage. So in a Docker file, we can have multiple stages. We can have a build stage and a production stage. We can also add a comment here to make our code more readable, saying step 1, build stage. Now, while building this application, we don't need this user. This is only used for serving it, right? So I'm going to cut these two lines from here and move them down below. We'll get back to them in a second. So we create our application directory, copy all the files, install the dependencies, copy the other files. Now, we don't need to expose a port here. Again, this is used for running the application. So I'm going to cut this line and move it here. Now, instead of npm start, we're going to run npm build, because in the build stage, we just want to build our application. Also, we're going to replace the command instruction with the run instruction, because as I told you before, we can have a single command instruction in a Docker file. And this is used for specifying a default command when our container starts. So let's get rid of this. We're going to use run, npm run, build. So at the end of this stage, our application is built. Now we're going to start the second stage. How? Well, we're going to add another from statement, but this time we're not going to start from node, because for our production or for running our application more accurately, we don't need node. We just need a web server. There are many web servers out there. We have Nginx, Apache, IIS for Microsoft, and so on. In this lesson, I'm going to use Nginx because it's a very popular and fast web server. Now, Nginx has different tags. I'm going to use 1.12-Alpine. So this is Nginx 1.12 based on Alpine Linux, super small. Now, if we want, we can give the statement a label as well. So we can call this production stage. We only need this if we're going to refer to this later in this file. We're not going to do that, so I'm going to delete it. So in the second step, which we can specify here using a comment, we can say step 2. This is for production. We're going to start from a web server image, which is far smaller. Then we create our user. Now we're going to copy our files from the build stage. So here we add an option called from. And this is where we reference our build stage. That is why we gave it a label up here, okay? So we're going to go to our build stage and copy all the files from /app/build to usr/share/nginx/html. Now, this path you see here is a standard path for serving files using Nginx. You can find this in Nginx documentation on Docker Hub. Now, instead of exposing port 3000, we can expose port 80, which is the default port for web traffic. Then finally, we can specify a default command or an entry point. In this case, I'm going to use an entry point because every time we start this image, I want this command to be executed. There are no exceptions. So we're going to run nginx and give it a couple of arguments. The first one is -g. The second one is daemon off with a semicolon at the end. Now, once again, you can find these arguments in the documentation of Nginx. There is nothing magical here. So now that we have a Docker file for production, let's build an image using this Docker file. So here in our front-end directory, we're going to run docker build -t. I'm going to call this image vidly_web_opt, meaning optimized. Now we need to specify our Docker file. So -f dockerfile.prod. And then we use a period to specify the build context. All right, our build is ready. So let's look at our images. Take a look. Here's our new image. Look at the size of this image. It's only 16 megabytes. It's a huge improvement. So when deploying this application, instead of transferring a 300 megabyte image, we transfer a 16 megabyte image. Now there's one more step left. So in our front-end directory, we have two Docker files. One for development, the other for production. Now, here we have two compose files as well. We have to go to our production compose file and tell this compose file that we want to use the production Docker file in the front-end directory. So we're going to expand this build property and give it two sub-properties. One of them is context, which we set to the front-end directory. The other is Docker file. So what we had earlier was the shorthand syntax. This is the longhand syntax. Here we're going to type our Docker file name, dockerfile.prod, and we're almost done. Now we should also change the port mapping because now in our production Docker file, we're exposing port 80, not port 3000, right? Okay, good. Now let's verify it's working before moving on to the next step. So back to the terminal, let's get out of the front-end directory. We're going to run docker compose build. But first, we have to specify our compose file, docker-compose.prod.yml, like this. Let's go. Good. The build was super fast because everything was in the cache. So let's look at our images one more time. So here's our new web image. Look at its size, 16 megabytes. Beautiful. So now with this amazing optimization, we are ready for deploying our application. And that's what we're going to do next.